If we can shift gears for a minute, though, because I know that you're a big science communicator online. You are actively engaged in Twitter and blogging and all of the social media aspects. So we all do as well, and we're very much interested in that. Lauren is a science communicator and so on. Do you have any thoughts on that? You'd like to share with the audience, or like what your goals are for that in terms of your work and how you feel it's helped?
Yeah. So interestingly, when I first started Twitter, which was about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago at this point, I thought that it would be a really good way to do outreach with the public. And it turned out to be less that, although I do have a number of sort of just general followers, and has turned more into being a way for me to network with other scientists like all of you guys, whom I would never have met without Twitter, and also science journalists and communicators, which has been a really interesting it's opened up a whole different set of conversations. And I used to be very anti-Twitter, and so now, like many people who used to be against something and are now for it, I can get a little excited and be a little evangelical. So I'll try to rein it in. But I found it so useful just from a professional development perspective in terms of being able to get advice very quickly. To demonstrate this, I visited the National Science Foundation in October and talked to them about using social media to promote conversations. And to demonstrate the power of Twitter, I started a hashtag at like 10 o'clock at night called First Grant, and said, hey, do you guys have any advice for someone writing their first grant? Please tweet to First Grant. And then over the next 48 hours was just getting a constant stream of advice from people. Just instantly the conversation started. And so I use this as an example to show the folks at NSF, like, look, you can generate a conversation very quickly that actually has really useful, meaningful information, even though it's only 140 characters. I'm able to get help with R really quickly, and statistics, and so from a selfish perspective, you can actually save yourself quite a bit of time, just because really great crowdsourced content, like important blog posts, important papers, kind of come to you. At the same time, in order to cultivate those relationships and the kind of followers that will make that happen, you also need to be able to give back, right, as well. You can't just necessarily be a taker when it comes to social media. And so I found it to be really interesting. And also from the science communications perspective, as a scientist, I feel as though as a publicly funded scientist in particular, I have an obligation to make my work accessible to the public. And part of that involves just being open and available, but also part of that involves participating in conversations with science communicators about what the future of science communication should look like. Because science communicators are often the go-between between me and the public, or they're sort of they create the opportunities for me to share my work with the public. And so in order to have that process be as meaningful as possible, it's really, really important for me as a scientist, and for all of us as scientists, to be participating with science communicators in these conversations about open science, about what should science writing look like? How do we get away from this reporting the paper of the week from one of the big 3 journals, and into more context-driven, deeper kinds of stories that represent the process of science? And so I would say that's another big theme. And then another one is just reaching out to and creating a space for community. So I've networked with a lot of women in science in particular, and have found that it's just a really nice way, especially if you're, I know a number of people who are isolated at their institutions. They might be the only biologist, or they might be the only ecologist at their small university, or they might be in a department where they don't really have a lot of women, for example, or people of color. And so Twitter can be an incredible way to get you connected really quickly with different communities, and have meaningful interactions, and sort of peer support.
Jacqueline, just when you were talking about, I know that you're really interested in women in science, and you've written an excellent post on imposter syndrome, and I know a lot of people find that really useful. I was just wondering if you could maybe say a little bit about that, if any of our listeners are experiencing that and how you dealt with it?
Yeah, so it took me a really long time, as I'm sure it does to many people, to realize that imposter syndrome was a thing. When I got to grad school, I thought that everyone around me was more together, more capable, had a better background. I had never taken a college math class. I started off with a humanities sort of focus, and then moved into science, and then went to kind of an more of a progressive college. I did my undergrad at College of the Atlantic, where there's no sort of set curriculum, and basically did the equivalent of changing majors halfway through. But I was able to do it in 4 years because it's a liberal arts institution. I think that makes me I think that's made me a stronger scientist than I would have been otherwise. But I got into grad school never having taken calculus, having very little stats background, and all I could think of was all these people are smarter than me. They're more capable. They're more together. But someone will find me out, right? They will figure out that they have made a mistake and they should not have admitted me, and then everyone will know, and I'll be outed to everyone. But what I didn't know is that everyone else, you go to these orientation events or whatever, you're sitting in a seminar, everyone else is thinking the exact same thing, and nobody wants to talk about it because they think everyone else in the room is more together than them, or et cetera. And so there are conversations that we just don't have with each other as peers because we're afraid of sounding foolish. And unless your advisor or a mentor or someone tells you that this is a completely normal feeling, you have no way of knowing. And it really took me until I was like halfway through my PhD before I realized that I had gained this incredible body of knowledge and research tools, and was able to really feel as though I'd accomplished something. And I think for me, mentoring became a really important part of getting over my imposter syndrome. And the other thing I should say is that it's kind of like a sine wave, right? It comes back. So as a PhD student, finally I was feeling really confident, and then as a postdoc, I felt it a little bit, and as a future faculty member, I'm starting to feel like, these imposter syndrome feelings kind of creeping back up again. But I think the way in which it interfaces with, for example, women in science, is that if you don't see a lot of people like you in the group, or with something like the Leaky Pipeline, if you watch the other women in your program sort of dropping out at different stages, and the representation of other people like you getting smaller through time, then you're more likely to feel like an imposter, right? Because you literally are the only person. You might be the only person in the room who is like you. And then I think if you don't have the right kind of mentoring, it can be very alienating. And I was very lucky to have good mentors, but for me, getting over my imposter syndrome eventually became a matter of sort of almost like social justice or activism, because I felt like, you need to get over this, because women are socialized to not be assertive, to not be confident, to not own our own accomplishments, right? Women are socialized to say things like, oh, I had help, or oh, I was lucky. And so for me, owning up to the things that I had accomplished was a big part of getting over my imposter syndrome, and admitting that, yes, I do deserve to be here. I did earn, every accomplishment that I've had. And it's not an accident, and no one's going to kick me out of science because I'm not supposed to be here. So
I can sympathize with some of that. I mean, I'm a theoretical biologist who's never actually taken a formal course in biology. So maybe I shouldn't admit that on air.
I outed myself as not ever having taken calculus. So.
Do you
That's
think
all right. We just defer all this math to Steve anyways.
Do you think it's a particular problem for women in science because of institutionalized sexism? Do you think that's still a major issue? And if so, what can be done about it? I know you were involved quite heavily in the response to Women's Space, the article published by Nature.
Yeah.
So just if you want to say a little bit about that.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, I urge you to just Google the word women's space, because there was a a short piece of short fiction that was published in Nature that relied heavily on stereotypes of women as sort of gatherers or as shoppers, people who had this inherent knowledge about domesticity. And it was, to me, to this day, as a science fiction fan, to this day I still have no idea why they would publish something that was so offensive and also not great not great fiction, when there's so much really good science fiction. I know so many starving science fiction writers out there, right? And they'd be great for Nature Futures. But so I think that, to me, is a really good example of institutionalized sexism, right? People think of sexism as in this very old school way sometimes, where it's your boss grabbing your ass as you go through the hallway, and that does happen. Not to belittle those kinds of experiences. So what I think is actually much more prevalent is not necessarily these overt examples, but this culture, or what's called institutionalized sexism, where you have structural barriers to women being successful. For example, a tenure clock that doesn't necessarily mesh very well with a biological clock, or a lack of support for parents, which, since women tend to do the majority of the labor in terms of domestic efforts, then that disproportionately affects women, or things like Women's Space, which creates a culture that where women feel like they are seen as purely domestic, right? They're not seen as equal colleagues or scientists, and it could be something as simple as there have been plenty of studies that have come out that have shown that if you have, the women are more likely to be given sort of the equivalent of domestic tasks in a department, for example, like I would like you to organize the holiday party, or I would like you to to update the website, or these sorts of like secretarial kinds of tasks, and if I think overcoming these. In order to overcome these, you have to start by acknowledging that they're real, and thinking about sort of being mindful, right? Like if you're a PI in a lab, and you have a tendency to always ask the female grad students to organize the holiday party or to clean the lab, and I know that this happens, not in my lab, but you might just think about it. Be aware that you're doing that. If you're at a meeting and you're always asking the female students to go make photocopies or get coffee for everyone. Those are sort of ways in which these things can play out. I also think that there are real structural approaches, like being really conscious about your hiring practices. Thinking about the ways in which you, as someone who's organizing a symposium, can really make an effort to have good diversity. But we also have to tackle it at the institutional level, where you have to advocate for things like delayed tenure clocks and maternity support and paternity support. So there's a lot of different structural elements. So it's sort of all the way from the the level of the institution or the university all the way down to individual behaviors, I think.
Sure.
Yeah. Sorry, that was kind of a botched answer, but I got a little thrown off.
No, that was really good.
No, so we've got a late joiner here. Bug has jumped in at the last minute, and so,
totally screwed up your audio. Sorry.
Oh.
That's all right. Bug, Jacqueline, do you know Bug Girl?
We've met at Science Online. Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
All right, and Bug seems like she has something to say on this, so let's hear it, Bug.
No pressure.
Deep end, 3 in.
Yeah, no, I just am sitting here nodding my head, but also at the same time being really kind of depressed that we're talking about this still. And when I was a grad student, we were having the same damn conversation. And it's a little better. I mean, when I look around at who I see as at professional meetings, like Ecological Society, Entomological Society, it's not as bad as it was in the 80s when I would be the girl and there'd be a few other of us, and people would openly hit on you in the bars. That was really obnoxious. And so that's gotten better, but we're still having the same conversation about how there is a leaky pipeline and people do drop out and people are treated differently. I mean, I'd be willing to bet not a single one of you guys has ever been asked if you are your secretary.
Mm.
But I get asked if I'm Dr. Bug Girl's secretary all the time.
I mean, I just got so I put out a call for grad students, and I had a couple of male prospective grad students refer to me as Miss or Mrs. Gill.
Yes. Oh God, yes.
I have a PhD. You know, I might not be Professor Gill yet, but I'm definitely Dr. Gill. You know, and
and it's so frustrating when you'll be with a group of male colleagues, and they'll introduce people as Dr. Smith, Dr. Jones, Miss Bug Girl, and it's like, whoa, wait a minute.
Yeah. Well, there's I think part of the issue too is that, as you know, unlike some of my colleagues in the humanities, as scientists, we don't get a lot of cultural competency training, and so it can be a bit harder to convince people that these things are real issues, whether it's sexism or racism or some other sort of intersection of social justice with science.
I'm sorry, I hate to play into that, but cultural what now?
Competency. Like you're competent or not.
Well, clearly I'm not competent, but
yeah, it's COMPE. Yeah.
Think of it like emotional intelligence is another way that people sometimes phrase it.
I've just never heard of training for this. I don't know what does that entail?
Well, just, I mean, as scientists, we don't, if you go through college and you take the bio track, right? You might never ever take a class on feminism or race in America, or you know, you just might not ever even be exposed to these ideas. And so I think that contributes to this simplistic idea that I mentioned before, of where we think of as you know, racism equals the KKK, you know, sexism equals the cigar chomping boss who, you know, pinches his secretary, you know, things like that. And so one of the number one privilege that you get as someone who's a member of a privileged group is the ability to not know that you have privilege, or to forget that you have privilege, right? And so so there's like a whole bunch of groundwork that you often have to do just to convince people that these are even important issues. And one example is, there was a colleague of mine at another institution who got a mid-semester review where she asked for what she could do to help students learn better, and one student wrote "teach naked," and and she addressed and she didn't make any assumptions about whether the person, it was blind, so she didn't make any assumptions about whether the person was male or female, but she thought about it, and then she stood in front of the class and she said, "This is bullying. This is not okay. And people who don't speak up about this are complicit in bullying. So for those of you who giggled and thought it was funny afterwards, it's not okay. And you might think it's a compliment, and there's this thing known as benevolent sexism, right? You might think you're paying someone a compliment, but actually it contributes to this broader culture of sexism." And this person was actually called into a dean's office, not her dean, but another dean, and told that by a female dean that it wasn't sexism, and that she didn't understand why this person got these kinds of compliments. But then again, I don't look like you, right? And so this dean is already reinforcing this idea that people women who look a certain way, a woman dean is, you know, reinforcing this idea that people who look a certain way are you know, should expect these kinds of statements, and was basically telling her it's not sexism, she should get over it, and maybe that it was her fault for not being a better classroom manager. So, you know, so again, sort of all these sort of classic issues, right? So this is someone in a position of authority who, in theory, should have this kind of emotional intelligence or cultural competency training, and just clearly does not, right? And so that at that level, that's where you have a breakdown. And a failure of the institution to support the woman faculty, who is now seen as a troublemaker, right?
Yep.
That is.
Now she's branded by male colleagues as a troublemaker.
Yes.
It's kind of, well, quote unquote interesting to see these things, because I mean that to me at least that's when I feel most like the Twitter echo chamber effect, you know, because I see like among my scientist fellows on Twitter, you know, you see them all the time talking about these things and being very open and critical and aware, you know, and you get the impression that, well, you know, this is something people are very aware of, and they're acting on it, you know, all the time. And then you go to a meeting, or you know, you see something like that happen at your institution, or you just see some like inappropriate behavior at a conference, and then you realize, well, maybe that's not really as widespread as it appears from the people that you talk about, right? And I mean, yeah, I mean, all you need to do really is go to a conference to see these things.
Right, and we think, and I think we think that, you know, scientists, because, you know, we're educated, we're often liberal, you know, that we would get some of these other issues too. Like, well, often you'll be like, oh, well, they get things like climate change, and they get the environment, and they get these other sort of aspects of our political identity, but then they fail at things like gender, or they fail at things like race, and we haven't even talked about things like, you know, homophobia, etc. But I mean, so I think women in science, there's been much more of a discussion, as frustrating as it is, than, you know, some of these other kinds of social justice intersections. But yeah, and so I think actually one important thing too is to have allies, right? As frustrating as it is, having allies, whether that's, you know, male allies or you know, for people of color to have white allies, can be really important, because as women it becomes really exhausting for us to have to do this work on top of all of our other work and the extra work of domesticity that we're often, you know, stuck with, to also do this social justice work, and to try to constantly educate the male faculty, and to constantly educate our male colleagues, and over and over and over and over again the same sort of issues come up. It gets exhausting, and so to be able to have a guy come in and say, hey, fellow guy, that's not okay, and this is why, can actually be really helpful. And a lot of guys
hugely helpful.
Yeah, and a lot of guys have imposter syndrome, right? They think, like, I'm not qualified, I don't know enough about feminism, I can't talk about these things. But it's really, really helpful.
Well, I'm not gonna lie. I do sometimes, like, I think about these things, and, you know, I mean, it's an issue of concern, but I don't always know what to do about it, right? And, you know, I'm aware that I'm privileged, and, you know, I'm in this position, and it constantly scares me that I'm, you know, doing something that I shouldn't be, or that I'm ignoring something that I should be paying attention to. I don't know what to pay attention to. I don't know what actions to take, you know.
Well, I would say the biggest thing you can do, and I say this as somebody that, so especially as a white woman that works in communities of colors a lot, it is really, really important to not stay silent. Because if you're in a group and someone says something really obnoxious, if you are quiet, they will assume that you agree.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really important, just even, dude, that's not cool. You know, that it doesn't have to be a well thought out philosophical statement with citations about why it's not cool, but just being able to say, wait, I don't like that. I don't think you're behaving correctly. Let's rethink this. And I think there's also a big difference between saying you are a racist, which will make everybody flip out, and I think that thing that you said might be a little racist, which is criticizing the words and not the person. Now, the person may be an asshole racist, but you're not going to get anywhere. And honestly, you can't really change people's opinions. You can modify their behavior. And it's behavior modification that we're really after, is to get people to think a little bit before they invite all guys to a symposium and never really think about, have I remembered to not just invite people from my own personal friends?
And also, yeah, if you look around like say you're at ESA or whatever conference you're at, and you're out for beers afterwards, or you're out for beers, your Thursday happy hour or whatever, and you look around and you only see if you only see other dudes, one of the ways in which institutional sexism plays out is that those conversations that you guys all have together, it can often be really important, and there can be really cool ideas shared, and maybe even collaborations or projects that come out of that. And so inadvertently, by excluding women, there are whole conversations that they never get to be a part of, and that's sort of one of the ways in which these very completely unintentional and very subtle expressions can play out over the long term that disadvantage someone over the course of their career, just by not being around when certain conversations happen. And so I think just being mindful is really important, and also just taking a minute, because as Bug said, it's not someone's privately held attitude doesn't necessarily create a hostile environment for, say, if you want to have, if you want to increase diversity and you want more students of color or women students or whatever, then someone's privately held opinions don't create that hostile environment necessarily as much as the overtly spoken ones. And so we keep talking about the behavior, right? And so if we want to increase diversity in science, it's not just these really cool programs, things like SEEDS with ESA that are important. It's also just, we can't just rely on the fact that ESA has SEEDS and say, sweet, we're all set. We don't have to really think about this ourselves. Like we're not off the hook, right? The things that we do every day are often the things that end up, contributing to the leaky pipeline in the end.